I'm just calling about the Ukraine stuff. I'd say I largely agree with you guys, except the one thing I would push back on is I'm generally just not supportive of any U.S. arms shipments. And I guess I'm mainly calling because there's a little bit of media criticism I've noticed, and just general left-wing kind of circles. I've noticed something with Ukraine. I feel like you can't express any kind of opposition to just blanket U.S. arms shipments. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. A lot of
well, you can
CNN mainstream. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, on corporate media, you don't get a lot of diversity of views. But I
push back.
I really, I had people on Twitter when we talked about, or I expressed my opinion on it. So you're getting crushed. It's it's, you know what? I'm getting criticism because people disagree with my opinion. Nobody's shouting. I mean, it may feel like people are shouting you down, but that's not. There are times where you take positions that are contrary to what the majority of people within a certain context believe, and I think honestly, it is, broadly speaking, not necessarily within the context of that issue, but broadly speaking, absolutely wrong to focus on the pushback that you're getting. Because we've seen plenty of examples where that becomes sort of that supplants the issue itself and becomes your methodology. If you have a position that is contrary, and look, the fact of the matter is, we live in a country that has been more or less in the war game for hundreds of years. The mentality of our population is that we are the most powerful country in the world at this point. Different times it was we have a manifest destiny, and we have the armaments and we have the responsibility. I mean, it's a tough thing to parse. I sort of believe that I do believe that on some level, if we're going to have this capacity, we have a responsibility to stop genocide. The problem is that for me anyways, how do we determine what constitutes genocide? And that's another question. I mean, that was part of the reason why I had supported the limited action in Libya, because the UN had decided that it was a potential to stop genocide, and then we overstepped that mandate, and now I have less faith in that mechanism. But
well, I think the Libya point, I think, is a good point. I mean, I was just out of high school when that happened, and I was all gung-ho for the intervention. I mean, I consider myself probably some type of socialist or communist at this point, but I thought we were completely in the right. I thought it would be a limited operation. The more I've learned about that revolution, the more it sounds to me, it was kind of a Salafi far right. And I'm not trying to argue that with the Ukraine. I don't want to get into that. Right. But Libya, I think, was an example where there was a huge kind of media buildup, in the corporate kind of media sphere, and they just did what they were going to do. And,
but you got to remember.
There wasn't much.
But you got to remember, they did it under the auspices of the UN Security Council. So China and Russia also signed off on
agreed to it, and
they agreed to it because there was a threat from Gaddafi that he was going to level Benghazi, and I think at least for me, that was the determining factor. I at that time believed that we have a responsibility to stop genocide, and that the only way to establish whether genocide is taking place or is imminent is to basically let the UN Security Council establish that, because if China, Russia, and the United States agree on something, generally, at least in my opinion at that time, that's the best way to adjudicate this.
What better body is there?
I mean, like, I don't know how else, like, I can sit here in an office, you know, no matter where I am, and say, like, there's genocide happening or not. Like, you know, like, I don't know how you establish that. I frankly now am at a loss as to how to establish that. So here's the point. I think, like, it's a perfectly legitimate opinion to hold that the U.S. should not be manufacturing and selling and delivering weapons across the world. I mean, and, you know, you get pushback on that. You also just got to take it, because you got to know that's the context and what we're in, and not confuse the idea of people being vehemently opposed to your perspective with you being silenced. Honestly, because I really think there's a lot of danger in taking that tack there.
Yeah, I'm not trying to go down the, like, gray zone or, you know, weird kind of, like, right-wing conspiracy, like MAGA. I mean, I think a lot of those guys are grifters.
Yeah.
I do think some points, like fine points that I've heard, like, I don't know, I'm autistically following this conflict, or I guess I shouldn't say that, but like, I'm using it to procrastinate a lot of times on my grad work. You know, something I've noticed, like the stuff about Crimea, people act like we need to help Ukraine retake Crimea, and that just doesn't seem. There's, like, a lot of stuff with the conflict where it's like people. I feel like they haven't even, like, looked at a map to look at, like, Crimea. There's, like, a 5-mile wide bridge basically between Ukraine and that peninsula. I don't understand, unless there's, like, some coup or something like that in Russia, which I don't know how likely that would be. I don't understand how we expect the Ukrainians to retake that. You know, I don't think they can retake it by force. There's stuff like that. Like, I think there's, like, a lot of misreporting about the conflict, because we're essentially, I feel like you have to get basically Ukrainian propaganda or Russian propaganda on the conflict, and there's not much else coming out. Like, the Warner did an interview with Seth Harp, who I think you also interviewed, but he like, that's a really interesting piece he wrote on Ukraine, because it's basically, there's, like, a media blackout over most of the front. So I feel like as Westerners, we don't have any real assessment of the way the conflict's going, and they're very hard to predict.
I mean,
it looks like the Ukrainians might be able to push the Russians out of most of the, like, non-Crimean territory that they took, but it's hard to tell kind of at this point. It's like, what's going to happen with this conflict is there just going to be another 3 years of blanket funding and hundreds of thousands of people dying on either side.
That is my biggest issue with it. And look, you know, you can also read stories of, like, of horrific things that are happening to Ukrainian people who have been occupied by the Russians, and obviously that's not happening. It's not happening. You know, I mean, there are some who would argue that, like, you know, in the Donetsk region, that Ukraine is, you know, making civilians suffer as well. I really don't have the ability to assess that with the clarity of the reporting that we're getting in terms of, like, Russian atrocities in places that they have occupied in Ukraine. With all that said, I agree that at the very least, and this seems to me the bare minimum of any conflict that we engage in or fund, that we need to articulate parameters. Like, we do this with the funding theoretically. Well, we do it with the funding that we're getting, at least in terms of the conditions that we're providing some weapons to Ukraine where they can't be used to strike with inside Russia. I think that's good. And I think, like, you know, if people accept the concept that we do that, because, look, would it help?
That's a slippery slope. Yeah.
Well, but my point is, it goes both ways, because if Ukraine really wanted to, inhibit the Russian attack, maybe attacking Russia would make sense for them. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I don't have the ability to assess that. But we say you can't use our weapons for that. And if people think that that's okay, then the idea of conditioning and the idea of placing parameters on our involvement, they've already accepted it. And then really just becomes a debate of, like, what should those parameters be? And I think that should be something that, should be a conversation at the very least. I can understand some people saying like, we can't do that because then you give the Russians like a sense of like, this is where we get off. And they just have to wait until that. But I get all that. But part of the discussion can happen, in my opinion. But that's about it. But this is
another point too. I mean, I need to get back to work in a second, but another point I noticed too, there's a couple of calls over the summer about the grain shipments, with callers like asking about that. I don't know if you ever, I think you might have been, this is like a long time ago, but one thing that's interesting about that is, there's like all this hay about how it needs to go to the Middle East or Africa. Can you guess where it went when they finally did get some grain shipments released? It was immediately sent to Europe to feed cattle. So I feel like there's a lot of weird things going on with the coverage of it.
I know the grain that's going out now though is going to Africa and is going to
Africa. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yes, there's always this.
I don't know. I think
there's always this. There's always this.
Right.
And there's stuff that, I mean, frankly, I can bring on the top experts in the world on this, and they're only going to know one specific element of it. So I'm not sure in a situation like this, the broad strokes aren't as sort of like relevant as the specifics, because there is no, there's no like sort of like, lily white innocent in any of this, except for maybe, like civilians who are dying on both sides. And by both sides, I mean in the Donetsk, who may consider themselves separatists, and people in Ukraine. But
it's had full mobilization, so it is. I mean, the territorial defense units are taking horrible. I mean, these are just regular people, probably in Ukraine, a lot of them. So I think, they even had 2 high-profile prize fighters, Alexander Usyk and Lomachenko actually was fighting with them for a while. So they, I do think, I have a lot of sympathy for just, average Ukrainians that are just getting shelled to death and stuff. And, probably some of the Russian conscripts at this point. I just I don't know. I'm not really making any good points. I think it's
a frustrating. The
thing I've observed. Yeah. It's a disaster for the left, though. People are acting like it's a way for the left to push back against conservative kind of Russian empire or something like that, or this new amente weird conservative alignment of him and Orban and stuff like that. And I don't know if that's true, because these are just anecdotal evidences, but pieces of evidence. But my sister she has a friend that's fairly progressive from Finland, and she was visiting her over August, and the lady heard somebody that she thought was speaking Russian and just immediately went into you're the devil. And the person was actually a Ukrainian refugee. So I think it's going to lead to kind of
I'm not sure that is
maybe of militarism within NATO, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's expanded NATO, but that's a direct result of what Russia did.
The war is creating militarism.
Yeah,
exactly. That's the thing, is that it's not just a disaster for the left. Yeah. It's a disaster for everybody, I think. But appreciate the call.
Yeah.
Not going to exactly denazify anything.
No. And I do think that, look, I do think that it is too facile to dismiss the idea of a rising fascism in the world. I just don't know if, is it a bad thing to pull the alarm a little bit too early versus too late? It's dangerous either way. Panic Surfer, y'all seem to be suspicious of degrowth as a political project that could be hijacked to justify austerity. To me, degrowth can either be voluntary, done by humans, or involuntary, result of collapsing biosphere. I've heard Sam speculate on the latter before. Doesn't voluntary degrowth seem like the better of the two options, or is there a third option I'm missing? I don't know. It's
Yeah, I mean, there's a Branko Milanovic quote about like it's just not a political saying we're going to just all have agreed that our living standards on mass are too high and that's going to be our political identity. I think is ridiculous, and so I'm very in the anti-degrowth camp.
Malcolm Harris, who's been on this show before, he wrote something for Defector a few months ago about degrowth and the kind of the arguments for and against. It's pretty interesting if you're a subscriber. It's called Growth for What? The Shaky Promise of Green Capitalism.
I just am, I mean,
to me, it's similar to the defund problem, which is like, I don't like criticizing defund as a slogan, but it's just purely negative. And to me, it seems clear that you are going to need to grow sectors of the economy, certain sectors of the economy, and then others are going to need to be shrunken.
Yes. And like, you know, at the end of the day, is there necessarily some magic that's associated with like 0.2, you know, like a negative growth for, you know, and I mean, if there was a mechanism in which we could, in some way, distribute the degrowth in a way that was equitable. I mean, let's be honest here. Like, when we look at the GDP, what's driving it? Is it the 50 percentile of people who don't have the same amount of income as like the top, you know, whatever it is, 5%? You know, like degrowth is...
It's technocratic too.
I'm not sure what that means. But
look, if they can get a political movement behind degrowth, Godspeed. Yeah,
I just think that like it's too blunt of an instrument that you're talking about, both as a political matter and as like as a policy matter.
And I'll just say, like Mike Davis, I'm reading City of Courts, his book on Los Angeles politics, and it comes out of, and like we talk about the PMC, this comes out of like sort of Sierra Club environmentalism of people who had homeowners and wanted their environments to like not see skyscrapers built in it. Like I don't think it's very left, and I don't think it's a really. I don't think it's a technocratic solution with like a good justification for the technocracy.